It was October 1973. The world had never heard the word stagflation, because economists were certain it was impossible. Within a decade, it would define an entire era. For 25 years, oil had been cheap, almost embarrassingly cheap. A barrel cost around $3. Factories ran. Cars grew bigger. Nobody planned for scarcity. The global economy after World War II was built on one quiet assumption: that energy would always be abundant, and always be affordable. The United States, Europe, and Japan had rebuilt entire economies around that assumption. Highways, suburbs, industry, all powered by oil that flowed like water. But underneath that comfort, a fragile arrangement was holding the whole system together. One most people never thought about at all. That arrangement was about to break. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The war itself lasted less than 3 weeks, but its economic aftershocks would last 10 years. The United States, along with several allies, resupplied Israel with military aid during the conflict. The Arab oil-producing nations noticed, and they responded. In the days that followed, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an embargo, cutting off oil shipments to nations that had supported Israel. It was the first time oil had ever been used as a deliberate, coordinated economic weapon on a global scale. The effect was immediate, and it was brutal. Oil prices did not rise gradually. They quadrupled, from around $3 a barrel to nearly $12. In the United States, gas stations began running dry. Lines of cars stretched for blocks, sometimes for miles, waiting for fuel that might not come. States introduced odd-even rationing. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could only buy gas on odd-numbered days. Fights broke out at the pump. Some stations posted armed guards. A country that had defined itself by the open road suddenly felt trapped. The U.S. government lowered the national speed limit to 55 miles per hour, not for safety alone, but to conserve every possible drop of fuel. Daylight saving time was extended through the winter, just to squeeze a little more efficiency out of every daylight hour. But rationing gasoline was the easy part. The harder problem was what oil prices were doing to the entire structure of the economy. Oil wasn't just fuel for cars. It was in everything: plastics, fertilizer, shipping, electricity, heating. When its price quadrupled, the cost of almost everything followed. Inflation, which had already been creeping upward through the early 1970s, suddenly accelerated. By 1974, prices in the U.S. were rising at nearly 11% a year. Normally, economists believed inflation and unemployment moved in opposite directions. When one went up, the other went down. It was called the Phillips curve, and it had guided policy for a generation. The oil shock shattered that theory completely. Because this wasn't inflation caused by too much demand. It was inflation caused by a sudden, external shock to supply, and demand didn't need to fall for prices to rise. Businesses facing higher costs didn't hire more workers to meet the moment. They cut back. Unemployment climbed at the very same time prices did. By 1975, U.S. unemployment had risen past 9%, while inflation remained stubbornly high. High prices and high joblessness together, at once. Economists scrambled for a name for this contradiction. They landed on one: stagflation, stagnant growth combined with relentless inflation. It was a word almost nobody had needed before 1973. By 1975, it was on the cover of every newspaper. The pain wasn't confined to the United States. It rippled outward, hitting economies that had almost no oil of their own. Japan, which imported nearly all of its oil, saw its post-war economic miracle stumble for the first time in a generation. Industrial production slowed. Japanese consumers, fearing shortages, began panic buying toilet paper, a strange, human detail from an economic crisis thousands of miles from its source. In Europe, countries like West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom faced the same squeeze, rising fuel costs colliding with already fragile currencies. Some European governments banned Sunday driving entirely, just to cut fuel use. Empty highways on a Sunday afternoon became a strange symbol of the age. Developing nations, many with no oil reserves of their own, were hit hardest of all. Import costs soared, and many were forced into deep, lasting debt. The embargo also exposed something deeper: how much of the modern world's prosperity depended on a handful of oil-producing nations in the Middle East. For decades, oil-importing nations had treated cheap energy as a given. After 1973, it was treated as a vulnerability. Governments scrambled to respond. In the United States, President Nixon announced Project Independence, a pledge to make America energy self-sufficient within a decade. It was an ambitious goal. It would not be met, not in a decade, not for generations. Still, the crisis did spark real, lasting change. Fuel efficiency standards for cars were introduced for the first time. Insulation, conservation, and alternative energy entered public conversation. In 1975, the U.S. created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, a vast emergency stockpile of oil, meant to cushion the country against the next shock. Because by then, everyone understood there would be a next shock. The embargo itself was lifted in March 1974. But the underlying problem, inflation without growth, did not go away with it. Through the mid-1970s, central banks faced an agonizing choice: raise interest rates to fight inflation and risk deepening unemployment, or ease rates and risk inflation spiraling further. Time and again, policymakers chose the cautious path, accepting persistently high inflation rather than forcing a painful recession. It felt reasonable in the moment. In hindsight, it let inflation become entrenched, expected, even normal, baked into wages and prices alike. By the late 1970s, the American public had grown weary. Prices kept climbing. Paychecks couldn't keep pace. The optimism of the post-war decades felt distant. And then, just as the world was catching its breath, history repeated itself. In January 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah of Iran. Iran had been one of the world's largest oil exporters. Its production collapsed almost overnight, as revolution and chaos swept the country. Global oil markets panicked, not because supply had vanished entirely, but because uncertainty itself sent buyers scrambling to secure whatever oil they could. Oil prices more than doubled again, climbing toward $39 a barrel by 1980. Over 10 times the price of less than a decade earlier. This was the second oil shock. And it landed on an economy already exhausted from the first. Gas lines returned to American streets, this time driven by genuine panic buying as much as actual shortage. Inflation, which had cooled slightly in the mid-70s, roared back. By 1980, U.S. inflation had climbed above 13% a year. The public's patience with half measures had run out. Something had to change, and in 1979 it did. President Carter appointed a new chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, a tall, cigar-smoking economist with a blunt, unshakable resolve. Volcker believed the Fed's earlier caution had been the mistake. Inflation, he argued, needed to be broken decisively, whatever the short-term cost. So he did something almost no modern central banker had dared. He raised interest rates aggressively, and kept raising them. By 1981, the federal funds rate touched nearly 20%. Mortgages became almost unaffordable. Business borrowing froze. It worked, but not gently. The United States plunged into a deep recession from 1980 to 1982, among the sharpest since the Great Depression. Unemployment surged past 10% by 1982. Factories closed. Farmers, crushed by high borrowing costs, faced foreclosure in record numbers. Volcker received death threats. Farmers drove tractors to blockade the Federal Reserve building in Washington, in protest of the pain his policy inflicted. But slowly inflation broke. By 1983, it had fallen from double digits to under 4%. It was one of the most consequential, and most controversial, decisions in the history of central banking. The decade that began with an oil embargo ended with a recession deliberately engineered to fix what that embargo had unleashed. Looking back, the 1973 oil shock changed more than gas prices. It changed how economists understood inflation itself. It proved that prices could rise even when demand was weak, as long as a critical input, like energy, suddenly became scarce. It proved that central banks, not just governments, held enormous power over the pain or relief that ordinary households would feel. And it proved that a handful of nations, controlling a resource the whole world depended on, could reshape the global economy within weeks. The world that emerged from the 1970s was more energy conscious, more cautious about inflation, and more aware of its own fragility. Fuel-efficient cars, strategic oil reserves, and independent, inflation-fighting central banks all traced their modern importance back to this single decade of pain. Even today, when oil prices spike from a war or a crisis, economists still measure the shock against 1973, the year the world learned how connected and how vulnerable it truly was. The lesson wasn't really about oil. It was about how quickly comfort can become fragile, and how long it can take to rebuild what one shock takes away. If you found this history valuable, subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that quietly reshaped the modern economy, and let us know in the comments which crisis we should cover next.